last weekend we went down to Washington, D.C. to protest the IMF and the World Bank because of their loaning and lending policies. They loan money to developing countries with the pretense that they want to help these countries, but in reality, these loans do more harm than good because the countries most of the time are not able to pay back these loans. So the IMF and the World Bank will take over their government and force them to cut certain what many might deem as essential programs, such as education, healthcare, all the kinds of like social welfare programs like that, and kind of create a population of people that are uneducated, poor, and desperate with no other option except for to work in factories that benefit the Western world and capitalism and consumer society. So we went down there to try and protest and stop that.
Yeah, and these groups, even if they did withdraw immediately from these countries that they're in, they still have pretty much ensured the failure of the future or the immediate future of these countries, because they've created a society that is completely unsustainable if it operated within, if it was a local economy. They totally changed the structure of the economy to become a sort of a global economy, and they force these countries to open their borders to trade. They create an export economy where these countries have to produce things on the global scale for other markets. So even if these people in these countries had local farms, had local businesses, that's pretty much completely eradicated, and people have to produce for the global economy. So this is just, these two institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, are just two of the major arms that are helping in the globalization of the world, pretty much, and the ruining of local sustainability in many countries around the world. We know that there's also many other companies and corporations and governments that are aiding in this also, but this past weekend especially was huge because it was the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that were meeting together for their spring meetings in Washington, D.C. And so for us to go and protest it was a big way and a very direct way of drawing attention to the negative policies, and a very direct way of trying to stop these meetings from happening altogether, and really showing that we don't agree with their policies at all.
And what's sort of, the purpose of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, outside of whether their policies work or not, is to entrench a very specific understanding of enclosure. That their entire goal is to enclose the planet in private hands. That they see the market as inherently able to do that. And what ends up happening is that us as people get reduced down to numbers. We become production units, right? Our land becomes a resource. And every single bit of that enclosure is another piece of control that we lose over our lives. That on a certain level, it doesn't even really matter whether their policies work or not. What really matters is the fact that what they've done is they've created a technocratic apparatus, an apparatus of numbers that they feel that they're the best to manage, and do that in a way that affects our lives. That their entire structure is based on plugging us into a machine that they call capitalism, and allowing that to run regardless of the consequences, because all they see are GDPs, and all they see are production numbers, and all they see are import-export numbers and currencies. What they completely miss is that all of those things are actual real lives. Every loan that they make affects people. Every single time that they outsource production, that means people lose their lives and lose their homes. That this is what they don't understand. And this is a kind of mentality that led to a financial collapse that's only so catastrophic because they've entrenched the market to the level that they have. And those institutions primarily, specifically the International Monetary Fund, are sort of the underlying guarantee agencies for the global market. That if a bank isn't going to get its money back, like during the Latin American debt crisis, if a bank isn't going to get its money back, what the IMF does is guarantee that the bank is going to get its money back at the cost of actual people living on the ground.
Right, and they're an enormous, the globalization they promote is an enormous homogenizing force, and the irony of it is that, any of the, cafes or info shops, as they like to call their bookstore. The IFC has a cafe. The World Bank has an info shop. They all talk about like celebrating culture and like look at this great internationalization and look at this beautiful coffee shop with all the different kinds of coffee and stuff. And they must just be masters at marketing, because they've actually tricked people into believing that they're like helping and preserving people's cultures when they're actually doing the exact opposite of that. Globalization isn't it's not like, oh well, we're all just becoming aware of other countries and other cultures and the world, we're becoming one big nation. Like it doesn't, it's not what it sounds like. We're homogenizing, well, the IMF and the World Bank and institutions like it are homogenizing the world into this one monoculture, where everybody's main purpose is to produce money and products, and the same money and products in every place that people can all buy in other countries, and everybody can just be exactly the same, and there doesn't have to be any differences. There just has to be money and production.
And the Zapatistas called it the multiculturalism of commodities. And it's really important because you go to something like the International Finance Corporation's coffee shop, and you see all these handmade goods made in Zaire or Nepal or so on. And what they really are a bunch of people sitting around in a sweatshop mass-producing ritual goods, and then those being sold as ritual goods. That the entire process is about determining whether a culture is viable based on its profitability index. It has nothing to do with the way that people actually want to live. And this is being seen in South America on a vast scale. It's being seen in Africa on even a vaster scale.
Can you explain the term ritual goods?
Yeah, like goods that are produced out of a certain cultural inertia, out of a certain organic movement within culture, that people produce these because there's a certain local meaning to them, right? That what capitalism does is it obliterates that. The local meaning behind an object means nothing. The only thing that matters is your production cost and the amount that you can sell it for. And so in this case, what you're getting are things like, hand-carved Buddha statues that are mass-produced in sweatshops in Nepal by 9-year-old children. And they're being sold to Westerners as a way to consume a culture that they don't really understand. That all we're doing is buying the object, right? And they call that multiculturalism. Because, like a rich white yuppie can have, goods from 16 different countries in their living room. But none of them actually mean anything. That the mass production process pulls any meaning that they have out, and it becomes a meaning of purchase, purely. That you can purchase this. You don't ever anymore have to have any involvement in the actual process. All you have to do is buy it. And this very concept gets extended to things like neighborhoods. Right, this is what gentrification is. It's a process of selling off a certain cultural inertia that's been going on in the aura of that, so people can consume it by buying it, while eliminating the very people that were there that made it to begin with.
It's like a gradual dilution of like cultures that may seem harmless to the people who are on the consuming end of it, but for the people who are on the producing end, it's very clearly harmful, and it's going to become vastly clearer to the consumers, I feel, very soon. But that's not even what's important. What's important is that the vast majority of the world is being exploited and, destroyed to an unbelievable extent for the Western world's greed.
Yeah, and there's been very little North American support lately in the whole anti-globalization movement, or a very specific type of anti-globalization, like the very harmful kind, like the International Monetary Fund's kind. In North America, there's very little resistance to this type of globalization because in North America, we're on the receiving end of it. It's seen as a positive thing for consumers in North America. So the protest that we went to, I feel like is a big sign of international solidarity with people that are struggling around the world and people who are on the production side of all these types of negative aspects of globalization.
I guess I'm going to jump in here with some questions, but what was the name of the protest? Did it have a name or an overall theme?
There were sort of two general names that were being put out by two different groups. That the overall sort of overarching identity was called Break the Bank, right? Which is an allusion to the April 16th, 2000 International Monetary Fund protests, which actually shut down the IMF, and that was organized under the name Break the Bank. Then within that, there were two different organizing initiatives, right? There was one by Global Justice Action, which still kept that name, sort of Break the Bank, but they were more moving in like, they were holding events that all had separate terms to them, right? The 5K, the Economic Forum, so on. The other initiative was being organized by Self-Described Anarchist Collective, and that was called the April Uprising Initiative, which is part of a much larger sort of insurrectionary anarchist initiative globally to respond to the financial collapse, which is attempting to use direct action to combat the power of banks and capitalists in a direct way. And it's part of a campaign that is actually gaining a lot of strength both in the United States and Great Britain right now, primarily.
Okay, and what form did that direct action take in D.C.?
There were a grand total, from what I understand, there were a grand total of 7 actions that happened. And actions are a very fluid term, right? Some were very small, some were very large. The first was there was a show, like a benefit show that happened within the security perimeter on Friday night, and that turned into a march through the Georgetown neighborhood in D.C. And the reason that Georgetown is targeted is Georgetown is the place where people like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton have houses. It's a place where IMF trustees live. It's the place where developers and capitalists largely base themselves and have for over 200 years. That Georgetown, in a lot of ways, is really the seat of power in D.C., that it's not K Street, like a lot of people imagine. So the attempt to go through Georgetown, and this got replicated again on Saturday night, the attempt to go through Georgetown is an attempt to disrupt the everyday life of the very people that are coordinating this.
So you said attempt. Did they not make it through there?
Well, the thing is whenever people march through Georgetown, the first Georgetown march was in October of 2007, and it was massively destructive. There were about 400 anarchists. There were upwards of $1 million in property destruction. Ever since then, the police will literally shut the neighborhood down and occupy it every time there's a march. Marches happened, but the entire neighborhood itself was completely gridlocked. Bars got closed down, restaurants got closed down, hotels get evacuated, and so on. The other reason Georgetown's targeted is that there's 4 hotels at International Monetary Fund, specifically high-level International Monetary Fund delegates stay at, literally down one strip. So the police will literally occupy that neighborhood to the tune of 12 to 1,500 cops for, a march of, 400 once, 300 another time, and the last night was maybe 150, something like that. And they'll put 12 to 1,500 police in.
Yeah, it was unbelievable, the number of police to protesters on Saturday night. We're going kind of out of chronological order, but Saturday night it happened after, like, the big main actions, like, on Saturday morning, but I was kind of hanging back from the main group on Saturday night because after what happened Saturday morning, I didn't really want to get that tangled up in everything, and the friends I was walking with were kind of starting conversations with the people around us because we weren't so obviously involved with the group. And a guy comes up to me and he asks, "Oh, what's going on here? It just looks like a whole bunch of cops. Like, what are they even doing?" And I was like, "That's a really good point. Like, because nobody even knew. Like, the crowd of cops was so deep that they couldn't even see the protesters, and there was an unbelievable number of helicopters flying overhead, and undercovers kept popping out of nowhere, and it was crazy the amount of resources they poured into keeping 150 kids who were walking down the sidewalk under control."
And I think one thing that should be mentioned before the sort of chronology of direct action even gets gone through is that this weekend, or this past weekend in D.C., they declared what they call an all hands on deck. What that means is that every single cop was on duty. So at any one point, there's about 7,500 police in the district. There's about 1,200 in the special operations division or protest police, all of which are trained in Israel. Actually, they spent 2 weeks in Berlin learning how to shoot rubber bullets at Palestinians.
Shit. I didn't know that.
And their commanders are all trained by the IDF. And they have like directed sound weaponry, which they used on Saturday night and so on. But they called everyone off duty. So the entire weekend, the entire city was a police state. So all of these actions happened within the context of essentially there being a blanket of police patrol constantly around the entirety of DC. So like the Friday night action happened. Then there were a series of actions on Saturday morning early. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, the International Finance Corporation got paint bombed by an anarchist affinity group. At about 5, a PNC bank in Wachovia got smashed up by another anarchist action, of which 6 people got arrested and are facing felony property destruction charges right now. And that action cost $110,000 in damage. Just on that action, it was something like 16 windows got put out on P Street. And P Street is sort of, the corner of P and 14th is kind of an advanced line in gentrification. It's sort of like pushing into the traditionally sort of Black Power-centric U Street neighborhood, which is where Howard University is and so on, and displacing that entire neighborhood. And P Street is sort of like the borderline of that. So things like banks and developers' offices got attacked. And then in the morning, at about 8 o'clock, you would walk downtown. Some blockades happened, and I guess you all can go into that in maybe a little bit more detail. But there were a series of blockades that happened, most of which were dispersed by the police relatively quickly. But at the same time, something like 4 different direct action marches started across the city at the same time. And the net effect of that was that the cops were so afraid of what was going to happen because of the actions that had happened earlier, that they completely gridlocked delegate transportation. They told them that they couldn't move. So up until about 9:30 to 10 o'clock, no delegate buses moved, no limos moved. All delegates that were getting into the meetings were getting there on foot. And because there were so many marches going on, the checkpoints that they were entering into kept getting shut down. And this actually caused a net effect of a delay in the meetings, which, if you actually read the articles about the meetings, caused a significant amount of chaos inside by sandwiching a bunch of really important agenda items together.
Wasn't that one of your goals to do that?
Right, of course. The goal was to shut the meetings down, of course, the ideal goal. But the reality of the situation is, with about 300 people, delaying the meetings for even a couple of hours in the face of, 7,000 cops is really incredible.
Yeah, every minute counts in that situation, because every minute that they aren't sitting in that room together is another minute that they can't, decide to give such and such a loan out to such and such a country and, begin their destruction there. And it sounds melodramatic, like, how bad can a loan be, I don't want to sound, apocalyptic about this, but, I have, read and thought about this a bit, and it sucks because it does sound so good initially. It's like, oh great, a loan to a developing nation. They can develop. But first of all, what does development even mean in present context? Of course we want them to have the good quality of life, not be dying of stomach cancer because Texaco poisoned their waters, not being able to find food, not being able to, grow their own food, whatever they want to do. They should be able to lead their lives how they want to lead their lives. But the problem is that we're teaching them to develop in ways that, and it's such an imperialistic process, we're teaching them to develop, but, they're being encouraged to develop in ways that, are dependent on fossil fuels, which, first of all, are, that's not going to be around forever. Secondly, even if we really genuinely did want them to be as rich as the United States, even if that was the IMF and the World Bank's goal, to be as developed, or however you want to say it, that's not how it's turning out. These countries are not, they can't meet the requirements that, the loans set, whatever. They can't pay back the loans, they have
I think the loans are engineered for that outcome.
Right, exactly, they are, and that's what sucks so much about it, because it's just got this pretense of charity, and it's really got this secret alternate agenda of imperialism and marginalization. I just want to really drive that point home, because I just don't want us to come across as being naysayers for any good that people are trying to do, because we want genuine good to be done. We just want it to be genuine good, not bad posing as good.
Right, and not centrally controlled by some group
Yeah,
of Western
exactly.
corporations. Right.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, if people want to continue, feel free, or I can continue with sort of the chronology of events. But throughout the morning, the marches kept moving around different parts of downtown. Part of the tactic was redirecting. that marches would be called for a certain point and start in another point. That cops would concentrate themselves in one area and there'd be no one there, and all of a sudden another march would start somewhere else. So they would disperse a march, and they did this a couple times. They would get people boxed in and disperse them, and they did this on Saturday night too, and disperse them one at a time, just for everyone to go to a park, meet up, and start marching again.
Yeah, it was so easy to reconvene.
Because what they were doing was they were running back and forth the entire time.
The police?
The police. And what this prevented was, and this is something that a lot of us learned at the RNC, and that is that we don't have to control streets to shut down a conference. We just have to prevent them from controlling them. That if they don't feel like they can control the streets, they're not going to move delegates. And this is exactly what happened, is that they couldn't actually control an area at all. That the only area that they controlled was the area that they were immediately in, and that's not good enough for them.
How did you tell all of your group where to go so that the police didn't know where that was?
It's not something I'm going to get into.
Okay.
But what I will say is everything comes down to communication on the street. Everything is about staying in real-time communication with the people around you, whether they're in your affinity group or in your collective or not. Making sure that there's text messages going out to people, making sure that people are calling each other. It's been noticed in the RAND Corporation report about Seattle that the way they termed it was that there was a sea of communications sort of floating above the demonstration. And this is exactly what was going on Saturday.
They couldn't keep track of everything.
And they couldn't keep track of it. It was moving too quickly for them. And so the minute that they would drop back to go deal with another action, the action they dropped back from would sprint down the street 2 blocks and build a barricade.
So you can send a text out and have it go to 1,000 people all at once.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
About police movements and so on. And it kept them 2 steps behind everybody. So what their entire tactic was at a certain point was to just try and group everyone into one march so they could suppress it. And at that point, the checkpoints had been shut down 4 different times. The march had just exited George Washington University. And all of a sudden a line of police showed up, pushed the march onto the sidewalk, pushed people over a fence, broke someone's leg. And then actually, and this is incredibly important, an Immigration and Customs Enforcement officer used a combination of pepper spray and tear gas on the crowd. Now, there's 2 things that are really important about this. The first is that they haven't pepper sprayed demonstrators since Bush's second inauguration in 2005.
Really?
Yeah.
In D.C.?
In D.C. And a lot of things have gone down since then. So this is an incredibly extreme response. The second thing is that Immigration and Customs Enforcement is not allowed to use physical force off of their own property unless it's to deal with an immigration issue. So that alone is a violation of the right to free assembly, but also sort of a violation of jurisdictional rules. That they use the ICE officers because they've run out of cops.
Do you anticipate legal action because of that?
I would assume so, although that's not sort of my wing of involvement in things. The other thing that's really important about that is when they shoved everyone into the park. Two other things. First, they brought out the armored personnel carrier. This is a direct attempt to intimidate the crowd. They never use this. It's a tank, essentially. And they had it filled with National Guardsmen that they had called up from Maryland. And they haven't used that since 2003, which was the first major anti-war demonstration after the war in Iraq started. And they used that on a anarchist block of about 1,000 people at the time. So it was a way over the top reaction. And then the other interesting thing is because of that way over the top reaction and because of the meetings being delayed, the media was milling around outside of the International Monetary Fund and saw the police attack the march and just rushed the park. Now, this was a good thing, but it also created a problem at a certain point. And this is something that the media needs to understand, is that we don't need them and we don't need them butting into our crap. When people are hurt, people are hurt. And we don't need them filming us when we're trying to take care of people that are hurt. And so there were a lot of confrontations with camera people in the park, with a lot of us trying to cover up camera lenses because the people that were hurt didn't want to be filmed. That the corporate media needs to understand that they are not gods. That on a lot of levels, I really don't care. And a lot of other people really don't care what kind of coverage you get. That the important thing is the effectiveness on the ground. And when they're doing things like that, they're being detrimental to that. But the other thing that they did do, though, was, and the importance of cameras, was that they prevented the police from attacking the park. And a lot of, I mean, there are 3,500 international press hits about that march because of that media coming in. So it's always this kind of tension, right? And I guess you all could probably talk more about Saturday night and what happened.
Yeah, I
that-
decided not to go to Saturday night because of everything that had happened Saturday morning, and it was just pretty overwhelming the whole weekend. And Saturday night was a little uncertain about the level of police reaction to our march on Saturday night. So there was some of the group of us from Binghamton who decided not to go, but then there was another smaller group that decided to go and just see what was happening on Saturday night.
Yeah, I initially really didn't want to go out on Saturday night because I was just concerned, and I was scared because of what had happened on Saturday morning. Saturday morning, I was pepper sprayed pretty badly, and it hurt a lot, and, I was kind of up at the front of the protest in the morning, not really intentionally, but that's how it happened, so I rolled with it. Holding signs and banners, which were very helpful to try and, keep the police line back a little
Are you
bit.
the one in the YouTube video?
Yes.
Okay.
That is me.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was up at the front, and, really witnessed, just the attitudes of the police was pretty unbelievable. They really seemed like they were enjoying themselves, and I really don't like to get personal about things like this ever, and I still am not getting personal about, I hate all cops, like I'm not going to go there, but these cops in particular really, really seemed like they enjoyed what they were doing. And I remember one cop, I remember him kicking me, and I remember who he is, and I remember getting pushed over, and I remember getting maced. And then I saw the video later of the guy who was stepping on me accidentally, saying, like, you made me step on that woman, I told you that I was stepping on her, and then you maced her, like, how do you feel about what you did? And then he smiled. The cop just gave him this big grin, and that just blew my mind. But anyways, so that's what happened Saturday morning, and that shook me up. But Saturday night, I did want to go out and see what was going on. And I wanted to hang back, if anything. It seemed like it was going to get crazy. So I was walking with the crowd for a while. The police started getting a little more aggressive, so I dropped out of the crowd and hung back with a few friends. So the cops got extremely aggressive. They started, breaking up the crowd into, like, groups of, like, 20 or 25. They would just detain a group of people where they stood on the sidewalk. They were on the sidewalk, first of all. The entire group of people was on the sidewalk. They committed no crime except for, shouting, which I guess can be considered a crime in Georgetown, disturbing people's nice dinners.
Yep.
But, they were actually detaining people who really didn't have anything to do with the march whatsoever. I witnessed a cop, shoving this one kid down the street who was clearly just out with his girlfriend at a bar, local college kid. A lot of really inappropriate police activity going on. My one friend, she was out there, she was in our group, was detained multiple times. She got shoved over and she scraped her knee badly and hit her head on the pavement because of that. She was dispersed multiple times, They would disperse people every interval of like 10 or 15 minutes and, bring them in a different, they would bring them like a block away and then turn them. But what they did with her was, because she had an attitude problem, they brought her many blocks away. She said multiple times, I don't know where I am. I don't know where I am. Can you tell me where I am? And they wouldn't tell her where she was. Brought her. The cop was, like, gloating about it. They were like, I'm going to bring her. She won't be able to find her way back. Like, brought her so far away. And, like, it was really scary for her because she's never been in D.C. before. So just really, really vindictive attitudes of a lot of the police. Like, they were taking it personally.
And the chief of police called her a douchebag.
The chief
Oh,
of
the
police
chief of the
called
Special
her a
Operations
douchebag.
Division. Yeah,
Called
Captain
her a
Harold.
douchebag. Yeah.
He's an asshole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing to know about the Georgetown March at night, and I think that this is really important, is the march had entered onto a side street. And the way Georgetown's structured is there's, like, two main commercial roads. There's M in Wisconsin. And they're real big strips of all corporate stores and, like, $50 cover charge clubs and, like, that kind of stuff. fancy hotels, private like clubs for rich people to hobnob and drink in, and stuff like that. One of the people that lives in that neighborhood is a DC council person named Jack Evans. Jack Evans is responsible for the closing of the Franklin homeless shelter, is responsible for the closing of 2 other homeless shelters, and pushing through gentrification initiatives. He works a lot with developers. He works a lot in issues like making sure that the International Monetary Fund and World Bank can own 6 blocks of real estate in downtown DC without paying any taxes. Certain things like that. And so the march was heading towards Jack Evans' house to do a home demonstration, got blocked off on the street by the police, and then numerous people reported that a helicopter flew overhead, shined a spotlight on part of the crowd, and then a weird light pattern started, and a bass tone was heard, and all of a sudden everyone under it got queasy. That this is a sound weapon. They're deploying it from helicopter. Usually they would deploy it from the back of a vehicle. This has never been used against demonstrators in the Western world. The only place where this has been used is Palestine and Iraq.
So you guys were the guinea pigs.
We were the guinea pigs. And
Apparently we were
SOD,
serious enough for them to think we merited that,
Yeah.
so I'm flattered.
Special Operations Division uses us as guinea pigs constantly. That you always see the newest weapons in DC. And what was interesting about it is reports say that as the march turned back towards P Street and closer to M Street towards the commercial district, that the minute it came into contact with M Street, the light shut off and the helicopter flew away because it was all of a sudden again in a commercial district. That the police disavow that this happened, but it's on film. And immediately afterwards, they shoved everyone onto the ground, essentially told them all to sit down, found organizers, dispersed them first, and then we're dispersing people at 25-minute intervals, and it took over 3 hours. What's up?
The leaders, they dispersed the leaders first. They just can't understand that. Whatever, it's fine.
And it took over 3 hours. That they detained people for the last time for over 3 hours, without actually formally detaining anybody. That in DC they have to detain individuals. They can't detain groups. And they violated the law that was set through courts that was set after the People's Strike in 2002, where they just rounded up an entire crowd of 700 people at Pershing Park and arrested them after detaining them for 3 hours. And the courts have said that they're not allowed to detain random people like that. And as was pointed out, it wasn't just anarchists. I mean, there were plenty of just like random Georgetown University students, people that were there drinking that night.
Sucks.
That the thing is that, you know, we're most of us are students or young. That if they can't make the differentiation, they're still controlling the space. And they were willing to use whatever means they had to do that. That just shows how scared and how off balance they were this weekend, that 7,000 DC cops couldn't deal with 300 anarchists.
That's all there were was 300?
About
Yeah,
300.
300.
7,000 DC cops couldn't deal with 300 anarchists because we were more coordinated than them. And so they had to resort to brute force.
But while they're detaining you, aren't you detaining them in a way?
Well, and this is
Yeah.
this is the interesting thing is any time, even, I mean, during March 21st, the anarchist feeder march on March 21st marched on the sidewalk through Georgetown. Okay, it was maybe 40 people, and there were well over 400 police, and they shut the entire neighborhood
That's
down.
exactly what happened in Georgetown on Saturday night. That we were on the sidewalk, the cops were blocking the roads, and people couldn't, get to their restaurants or whatever. And
They were doing your job for
they
you.
were. That's exactly what we said to them. We were like, that you're doing exactly what we want to do, right? They just kind of shrugged and looked at each other like they didn't know what, like, it's exactly, we were just, all we have to do is run, like, it was fun. On Friday during, we had a walking tour of different, like, areas
So good.
like, interest in DC, and,
Many of
we
the
came-
major banks
Yeah,
and,
Hotels.
hotels.
and we,
yeah.
we came to the World Bank bookstore, or info shop, as they like to call it, and kind of, we didn't, break anything, God forbid, but, we ran through the store, shouting things, down with the World Bank, and, they didn't like that very much. So, this cop came in and escorted everybody out, and then for the rest of the tour, we had a, motorcade of, 13 cop cars following us. 13 cop cars for a bunch of...
Just because we shouted in a
We shouted in the
bookstore.
bookstore. 13 cop cars started following us. It's just unbelievable, the response that they have.
It's
No
we-
helicopter?
No helicopter this time.
I
They
don't
saved
think
that for the
so.
next morning.
But also we were especially maddened at the World Bank calling their bookstore an info shop, because the term info shop
It's an anarchist.
it's an
Yes.
anarchist, a safe space, and a radical bookshop. They totally are attempting to hijack that term
Right.
for their bookshop.
Just like they hijack, objects from other cultures, like, a musical instrument or something, and they take those and they capitalize on them and they try to dilute and destroy the culture. They're trying to do the same exact thing. They're trying to capitalize on something that's very important and, dear to us. And it's not going to work, but they're trying, which is what's pissing us off.
And in order to defend that, the DC police are willing to spend millions of dollars and brutalize hundreds of people, including people that weren't even involved. That their big tactic in DC isn't necessarily to end demonstrations. It's just to disempower you so much that you end them yourselves.
Yeah.
It's a control game with them. And you can see this in Captain Harold when, he'll find organizers, myself included, and a lot of others, and literally just follow us around DC for the entire weekend. Like, he'll find out where we are, he'll track our cell phones, he'll, do whatever he has to do to make sure that we think that he's always watching us. That's a power game with him. And it's a power game with the rest of them, that all they're trying to do is stabilize a situation politically. They don't want it to get out of hand, as they put it, right? Hence, they don't want us to have any possibilities of the way that we can manifest our resistance. That they're going to, if we're not willing to play within the rules, they're going to force us to. And it doesn't really matter how many neighborhoods they have to shut down to do that, or how many roadblocks they have to set up, how many thousands of cops they have to call in, how many millions of dollars they have to spend. That their biggest goal is to stop us from being able to do anything outside of hold signs and march around in a square, which is a form of protest that A, doesn't do anything, and B, that they know how to control. That if we're going to be doing things which are destabilizing to their paradigm, then what they do is they set up a paradigm of how things are supposed to go. They call it a security plan. If we do anything to destabilize that paradigm, they're going to force us back into that paradigm, regardless of what they have to do that. And this weekend, that meant, they were spending $1,000 an hour to fly a single helicopter and flying 7 helicopters 24 hours a day. That they called 2,000 cops off of their weekends, that they mobilized National Guards people, federal agents, ICE officers, essentially anyone they could get their hands on, drove around something like 300 to 400 different cars just around the city to find people, and spent, obviously those sound weapons aren't cheap, and they bought those for us.
Thanks.
That just the toll on that is in the millions of dollars. And all of that is to protect a bunch of rich capitalists going into a meeting to decide things which determine the conditions of possibility for our lives. And the minute that we rise up to try and take those back, we have to deal with all of that. And that's really what the policing apparatus is about, specifically in DC. And I think that became very, very clear to a lot of people this weekend.
So, who organized these demonstrations, if we haven't covered that? I know anarchists are very loosely organized, but there had to be some kind of overarching structure that would, some group that would say, okay, let's all go do this now.
Actually, that's what was beautiful about this, is that
That
there
didn't
was a
really
certain
exist.
element of that, but that wasn't what was important.
Yeah.
That the blockades got organized by Global Justice Action, but it was just like,
Those were
A
really
newspaper-
honestly more diversionary tactics than anything else, and the main organizing was done by, undeclared affinity groups, groups of people that run together and conduct actions together. And the goal of this protest was that actions should not be announced as much as possible. They should be kept as undercover as possible. So the police didn't have time to mobilize against these actions, and the actions could be as effective as possible. And people really did a beautiful job of organizing in that way, I think.
So there was
over the
like a
past weekend.
surface kind of
There was a surface
structure
thing,
to it,
and
there
it's
was
not that
everything
those
we needed.
it's not that those the announced actions didn't do anything. We're just there as a diversion, but the smaller, more underground actions definitely played a huge role.
and this is kind of the thing, is that organizers, just as much as police, had no idea what turnout was going to be. All outreach was done under the radar. That the police, if you read their manuals, completely depend on pre-action information to be able to develop security plans. That in DC specifically, if you announce an action, when you show up, there will be 5 times as many cops as there are anarchists, and they'll surround a park and just follow you the entire time. that the only way to even have an action that's even mildly effective at all on any level, whether it's in the level of visibility or on the level of actual effect, is to not tell them that you're coming. And so,
how do you keep that secret? I mean, we have really a massive police state. Most people don't know that, but I mean, there's like a back door on Windows computers that sends everything out to the NSA if they want to see it. You know what I mean? They can track you by your cell phones. They can listen to everything you're
I mean,
saying.
the biggest thing
how do
is
you keep that from-
nonlinearity,
yeah.
right? That if you organize in one big group and you don't tell them that you're coming, they can still monitor that because everyone's chattering about the same thing. But if every single small affinity group has their own idea of what they're going to do, and all they're doing is meeting in a coffee shop and talking about it,
Yeah.
it is absolutely impossible for them to monitor like 50 to 60 affinity groups spaced out
It's
across
really
the country.
extremely decentralized. It's not like a bunch of small groups that are part of a larger group. It's literally just a lot of small groups that are part of themselves, and like that's the beauty of it. There's an overarching structure, but the smaller groups don't necessarily associate themselves with that structure. They're doing their own thing.
Yeah, like our group of people that went, we weren't a part of either of the larger overarching like organizing groups. We just came as a group of students, like anti-capitalists that just want to be a part of this march and be a part of helping to stop these meetings. And there were so many other groups from all over the country that came to do the exact same thing.
Yeah.
So we didn't go in knowing being a part of, I guess you could say, the main organizing groups or being a part of any other group that was coming. We just came as ourselves and just plugged in to the actions that were happening.
Well, and the role of the organizer changes very drastically. That what we're trying to do is we're trying to disrupt the mass movement paradigm that has existed before, which facilitates things like the hierarchies that we saw in the anti-war movement, right? Where steering committees were deciding what messaging was and where we were going and what we were going to do, and had marshals that were essentially protest cops enforcing that. That an organizer becomes more of a facilitator, but you're not a coordinator. That, our job was mostly to do workshops when someone called us and asked us to, but we didn't have to be at every single meeting everywhere and didn't want to be. That the organizing philosophy was based on creating an environment conducive to insurrection, not necessarily to create the insurrection itself. And this is one of the biggest shifts that I think is coming out of organizing after the RNC, is that we know now that we don't have to actually, in any sense, even pretend to exercise any control over what's going on, because people are going to know what to do.
Well, I guess if you all think the same way, you don't have to necessarily communicate
Well,
so
but
much.
it's not about thinking the same way. It's about diversity of tactics. So everyone has their own tactics, but what you need to do, and this is why communication is so important, is figure out how something like a public blockade can be reinforced by an unannounced black bloc. Yeah. Things like that, and how to move all of those around almost as chess pieces, right? People moving, people building barricades, people like going here and there, marches joining up and breaking apart. But it's about the fluidity, that the police are trying to generalize the situation, push everything into that generalization. So what you need to do is be as nonlinear as possible.
Small groups.
Small groups, and luckily for us, that very disorganization of situation is the manifesting of our desires in the street. You get space, you can manifest your desires and resistance the way you want to, and isn't that the world that we want to create, right? That it's an organizing model that doesn't divorce action from goal or theory from action. That it is the world we want to create just there now, and in that space.
Right. What I like so much about that philosophy is that, it's based on an idealistic perspective of, no one leader who's going to tell everybody what to do and when, and additionally, the effectiveness of it, which kind of proves our initial point, that there shouldn't be that one leader because it's clunky and ineffective, and, one person isn't, infallible, so it doesn't really make sense to have this one, powerful person, and then it's a huge waste of resources.
But it's also, it gives the powers that be a pressure
Right,
point to push
exactly.
that, and the whole thing falls apart.
Exactly.
The Black Panthers fell apart,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So, just on so many levels, I feel like it's just a great way to look at resistance. And it's not like, oh, we're protesting in this free speech box for a better world later. It's like, no, we're taking back the streets for a better world, like, immediately. It's not about waiting.
It's exhilarating to think
It is.
that you
It was an
create
extremely-
the world you want right
It was an
then.
extremely exhilarating weekend, and just the sense of community I experienced. You know, when people think of anarchists, they don't usually think of community, but really, like, the sense of community I experienced with these people that I had never met before, I felt, when I was pepper sprayed, like, that was actually the high point of my weekend, because I had never felt so well taken care of by people I had never met before. I just felt so, like, surrounded by love and positivity and hope in the face of all of those people, all of those police pushing back at us. You know, we just stood in that park and we, like, screamed at everybody around us. Like, we literally just kind of, like, roared at the end of it, because we were just so, like, full of energy and hope and excitement about, you know, the potential of what we knew we could build.
See, that's your crime right there, having hope.
I
You're
know.
not supposed to have hope.
Unless
Well,
it's for Obama.
Yeah. Right. And this is one of those really interesting things that the Zapatistas pointed out, and that is that, you know, our lives are generally non-existent in the eyes of the state or the economy, right? What we do individually doesn't matter at all. And the act of resistance is the act of making that matter, in a very literal sense, that you're throwing things to chance because you have the ability to control that situation potentially. But there's sort of the weird paradox that in order to do that, you have to be totally anonymous. And that feeling of running with 300 people dressed exactly the same down a street away from a line of riot police as people are building barricades, and you're just gaining more space and gaining more space. And the entire time what you're doing is you're fighting against the world's most powerful economists. People that you're never supposed to see, let alone be able to touch. And you're winning.
Yeah.
That in itself is a feeling so empowering that you can't even put it really into words.
It's really not. Yeah.
That it changes your
you can't
life and it
verbalize
changes
it.
you completely forever.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really exhilarating feeling not only to be part of such a large movement that is breaking down these hugely negative world economists, but also to meet so many wonderful people through the course of the weekend that try to live and think along the same lines that I do and are a part of this larger movement for change, and who are just, you know, I really connected with a lot of people and will hopefully stay in touch with all those people. And, you know, even though we were resisting lots of powers this weekend, we were also connecting with lots of wonderful people and seeing, well, hope for change. You know, so just starting that change now.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, sort of the funny joke of the whole weekend was the whole, like, hope for change thing, and how people kept joking around about how in the G20 protests in Great Britain, their front banner said "Smash capitalism, yes we can."
Yeah.
And just like this trend of co-opting Obama campaign slogans
Yeah.
is just so funny.
Yeah.
Because it is such a farce. I mean, like, the whole concept is, like, have hope for change and don't actually do anything because you're voting for me to do it for you.
Right.
Right? It's like the totally paradoxical political spectacle, like, coming to play. So, of course, like, that has to be co-opted in these
And,
really
you know,
funny ways.
Like most people, I used to be, you know, kind of more into mainstream politics and like, yay, like campaign for this person. And that feels empowering until you know what real empowerment feels like.
Yeah.
Like, it feels like you're doing something real and, you know, that's actually going to change things this time, until you actually are involved in such, like, I mean, I can't even verbalize it, but such like a dynamic group of people with so much energy and like so much actual hope and potential for change that like what you experienced before seems like a farce.
And it's so incredible because the very act of challenging your limits on the streets is the very thing that gives you the potential to build something else. That there's no notion that revolution is a singular act, right? But it's a process of building ourselves as much as it is building anything else. That the world
Holistic
comes from
process.
us. The world comes from us. That we are the world. You know, like there used to be, like, it's on the big globe in Scarface, but also, like, there was a Nas song about it that was just entitled "The World Is Yours," and there's like this very basic message behind that, and it's very true. We are that world, right? Not in the, like, cheesy sort of, like, kumbaya way that you know, the whole song came out in the 1980s, but, like, we are that in a very, very, very militant way if we want to be.
Yeah.
And in a certain sense, that's the only thing that needs to be asserted on the street, is that we're here, that we exist, and that what they're doing is bullshit, and that we're not going to let them get away with it anymore. And even if there's only 300 of us, that's still drawing a line in the sand. That all of a sudden, like, this demonstration defines the tactics of what we're going to be doing next. And it's just going to escalate from there, that they can't keep screwing us like they have been. That eventually they're going to have to deal with their own creations.
So in terms of escalation, I mean, do you expect them to ratchet up the repression?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
Like, the RNC was ridiculous. It was a $110 million security operation. And they still lost. Right? I mean, this is kind of the beautiful thing, though, is that they can keep ratcheting up all of their apparatuses. Right? But all that does is make them slower and clunkier and make them take more planning and make them take more logistics.
Harder. That's all it does.
It makes their gaze bigger, right? They have to look at bigger things all of a sudden, bigger contingencies. There's more chance involved. And the only thing we need to do is keep making that entropy happen. That they can build security apparatuses forever. But Mussolini still got hung and burned by his own people.
You know? What I always say is that what happened during the Vietnam War scared the crap out of them.
Yeah.
And they've been working on a massive repressive apparatus ever since then. And you're just seeing that now.
Yeah.
But also,
yeah, go ahead.
I think that type of police repression and state repression acts outside of the context of protests, just in everyday life.
Oh, totally.
You know, mainstream life, it's completely tries to placate the public and, you know, create this sort of, I believe it's a false reality of what American life is supposed to look like. And so even to, like, we were, you know, for the 1 to 2 days this weekend, we were reclaiming the streets, but also in everyday life, we're reclaiming our own lives for ourselves.
And this is the thing, the police aren't neutral, right? Like, this is of course the myth, right? Is that, like, the cops are neutral, but of course what that assumes is that liberal democracy is neutral. The reality of the situation is that this is a very specific political ideology that operates in the United States. And that there's very specific laws that are put in place under the mechanism of that ideology, and the cops' job is to occupy and colonize that space for that ideology. That they're not neutral, they're political shock troops, just like in Germany. They operate differently, though. But this was the beauty of this weekend, is that in downtown DC for a few hours on Saturday morning, and on P and 14th, and at the IFC earlier that day, and in Georgetown throughout the weekend, that assumption of order completely broke down. That something else was glimpsed at, right? That
Yeah.
it was put
Everybody
great by a
felt
kid
it.
from Philadelphia. You could feel it, you could see it. It was, the Situationists used to say, you know, like, under the paving stones is the beach. They're like, if you just ripped up enough paving stones and threw them at the police, you could get to utopia. That you saw a glimpse of that, you know, of that community. You saw a glimpse of that world just running away from the police on the streets.
And it's up to us to make that, you know, our entire lives. And it's not about, like, I feel like people's oppositions to the idea of anarchism, like, is that, well, how could that ever work on a large scale? Like, I don't care how it could work on a large scale. Like, I care about, like, making that my personal reality and the reality of the people around me every day. Because it's about, like, you know, pretty much unbridled, like, love and enthusiasm. Like, living life with those principles. It's like
Can't
a
have that.
philosophy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a philosophy with which to live your life.
You know, anarchism did work on a large scale in Spain in the 1930s.
On the Ukraine,
But all of
1920.
the, you know, the states ganged up on it and crushed it because they did
Yeah.
not want people to know that. They did not want that example to live.
But I think that one of the things about the anarchist movement is that it's not about a platform or an ideology on a certain level. That our actions themselves are discontinuous from each other. They're anarchistic in themselves, right? We are anarchistic in ourselves, just because we are we, and I am I, and you are you.
We're all together.
And we're all together. John Lennon had something there. But the thing is like, we're all together insofar as we're different. But so what you're seeing is what the state is trying to do is stabilize anarchy, right? That what the economy tries to do is channel anarchy into profit. But when you're sitting around with your friends deciding what bar to go to, all 8 of you will sit around and make a decision. But you don't get the situation where 1 or 2 of them go, no, we're going to this bar, and then beat everyone with a wooden stick and throw them in a steel cage if
Yeah,
they
like,
don't
how
agree
is
with
that-
them.
You don't
How
do
is-
that?
Do you do that?
Like, how is that a natural process? Like, oh, well, clearly it's natural for human beings to have leaders that tell them what to do. Like, yeah, like he just said, like, you don't, you know, if you're just together with a small group of people, that's not the structure you fall into.
Right. So human
automatically.
beings are naturally anarchic, and the state is
They're
Not
naturally
even naturally.
cooperative.
Not even naturally, but just our actions and our desires are, right? Because there's no two situations that are the same. There's no two people that are the same that come from those situations. That the state makes a sameness, right? The economy makes a sameness, but our actions don't necessarily have a meaning to them outside of the ones that we have. That it's not, Luigi Gallieni used to say anarchy will be, but it's not necessarily that anarchy will be, it's that anarchy is.
Yeah.
And it's that the movement, I mean, there's the back of Fighting for Our Lives, there's this great crime think pamphlet called Fighting for Our Lives. In the back of the first edition is a person walking on a hill, black and white shot person walking on a hill with a black flag, and all it says is anarchy is only the beginning. And that's really the thing, that all anarchy is, and all the anarchist movement is a fight for possibility to be able to determine what our lives are going to be. Yeah. That it's not an end point, it's a beginning.
I have the future isn't written on the back of this one.
Oh, that's the second edition.
Okay. It's called Fighting for Our Lives.
But it's about a beginning. It's about us having the opportunity to make mistakes, and us having the opportunity to learn from those mistakes, as opposed to having someone tell us what we're supposed to learn from those mistakes. I think a lot of us are still trying to process.
Yeah, definitely.
But what I would do is starting about this week, you're going to start seeing like report backs coming back from different affinity groups and collectives across the country on like InfoShop News and Anarchist News and stuff like that. And that's a really good source for other reflections.
And those are websites.
Yeah. InfoShop News is news.infoshop.org, and Anarchist News is anarchistnews.org. And just look at those, and you'll get a lot of the like, we're the people who came from New York City, and we think this, and these are the events we were involved in, and this is our chronology, and this is our critiques, and so on. And both organizing collectives will be putting those out in the next couple of weeks too.
One last thought.
Okay.
Last words. I hope people that even don't identify with being an anarchist, like, I hope they all choose to start reclaiming their lives. And, every time that you have a community garden instead of, going to a large-scale grocery store, or every time you bike or walk instead of driving, all those little
anytime you cook
decisions.
dinner for your friends, anything like that.
Every time you have a potluck.
Yeah.
Every time you share goods instead of using the monetary system.
Lend your neighbor some eggs.
Yeah.
Occupy an abandoned house.
Yeah.
Yeah. All of those moves. All those moves are very empowering for individuals to take.
Yeah. It's not about the label, That's not what's important at all. It's about, reclaiming your life and realizing what that means, because you don't know you're not living your life until you actually start living it.